My name is Kareem James Abu-Zeid. I'm a freelance translator, literary translator from Arabic to English. So I translate novels and books of poetry from across the Arab world. I have to say I studied quite a bit of classical Arabic. So the poet Al-Mutanabbi, he's in many ways considered, he's probably the single biggest poetic figure in the Arab world. Trying to think, he could be really equivalent to a Shakespeare kind of figure, not in terms of style or anything like that, but in terms of cultural clout. I don't think if you asked a bunch of people sort of on the Arab street or Arabic professors who's the most famous or considered the greatest Arab poet of all time, it would probably be Al-Mutanabbi. And it's interesting because his writing is so difficult. I say difficult to translate, but there's never been a successful translation into English. Well, he was writing in the, many people consider it kind of the golden age of Arabic literature, the Abbasid era. And a lot of the poetry is extremely complex linguistically. It's very dense. It's very sort of, the structures are very tight. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of double entendres, wordplay, also alliteration and stuff, though the alliteration you could translate. But then Arabic also has, so in English, the language tends to be pretty specific, concrete, direct. And English has a huge number of words. The vocabulary is very large in English. And there's generally, tends to be one meaning per word. It's pretty clear what a meaning is when somebody is speaking. And in terms of modern languages, it has a much larger vocabulary than a lot of other languages. Arabic is in some ways the opposite. It's still a vast language in terms of vocabulary, but there will tend to be many meanings per word. And many of them, often words will have almost contradictory meanings. And there's a whole category of, in Arabic it's called al-addad, and English linguists have now, or English language linguists have now started to refer to these words as contronyms. English doesn't have very many. Cleave is one of the only examples I can ever cite, generally meaning to slice apart, but it can also mean to bring together. I think in the Bible it comes up, the King James Bible, it comes up in that sense. So Al-Mutanabbi's poetry deals a lot with that, and especially with the range of meaning of words. There was a short poem by Dunya Mikhail, and this is, I don't know if I spent hours on it, but it took a while. This is kind of a love poem, part of a series of poems that kind of read as love poems. But so the first part, whenever you throw stones into the sea, no problem. The second part there in Arabic is atamawwaju, which is a word that comes from the word mauj or mauja, which means a wave. And atamawwaju means to become like a wave. Or you could say to become wave-like, or even perhaps to become a wave without the like. And that one definitely puzzled me. I was like, how are we gonna, especially it's such a short poem, it needs to read well. You can't go into, sometimes when there's a longer poem, you can explain things a bit more because you have that space. So that one took me a while. And I went with It Sends Ripples Through Me, which was not completely literal, but I couldn't think of any way to get the wave in there without it sounding very awkward. So the poem became, whenever you throw stones into the sea, it sends ripples through me, which also had a little bit of rhyme, which I liked. I try to approach the works I translate from a more literary perspective, but there's a political aspect to all of them, whether just by the nature of translating sort of modern Middle Eastern literature and Arabic literature in particular. And I about 2 years ago translated my first book of Palestinian poetry, which has done really well, and it got a fair amount of national attention. But even just looking at some of the reviews and the blog posts, going down to the comments, it just degenerated into this people who are writing, who I don't even know if they've even seen the book, but it turns into this Israel versus Palestine kind of bashing that has nothing to do with anything in the book. There were some slightly incendiary poems that we put in. The poems that talked about and this is a poet who's not he's anti-Zionist, but you couldn't call him really anti-Israel, and certainly not anti-Jewish. And there's even poems where he kind of embraces Jewish identity as, you know, interacting very strongly with Arab identity, in many ways forming a big part of Arab identity, particularly in Palestine. But then there's other poems where he talks about the impossibility of comparing any suffering to the Holocaust, and then really bringing in Palestinian suffering and just being kind of like, what do we do with this? Even there's one of his lines, he says something like, you know, grandmother, addressing his grandmother, you know, you haven't suffered enough for us to be saved. Which is a pretty potent thing to write, and not easy to publish in the US sometimes. So first I should say everybody has a different sort of take, or perhaps different takes on translation. And what I've found, especially with Arabic, is there's actually a lot of Arabic literature being translated. There's a pretty strong divide between what I would call more academic translations and more literary translations. And the vast majority in Arabic tend to fall on the academic side. Academic meaning they're very, very close to the Arabic text, also in terms of structure and all of this stuff. I would say, and I don't personally, those translations don't reach a very broad audience, and nor will they ever, because they don't read very well in English. So my own personal take, and the first rule for me, is that it really shouldn't, the text that you've translated shouldn't sound translated. It should sound, that doesn't mean there can't be aspects of the culture or anything like that. It doesn't mean that certain interesting structures can't be mirrored, but my take is it should sound like, if it's poetry, for example, it should sound like something a native, like a good English or American poet would write. And the same thing with a novel. It shouldn't sound stilted. It shouldn't sound translated, really.